Well, welcome to the Striving for Eternity Academy's School of Systematic Theology. We are in lesson number 3. That is the Attributes of God, part 3. If you have a syllabus, if you are an enrolled student of the Academy, if you are, you have a 80-page syllabus that you should be taking notes with. Some of you students like to chat in the chat room, and you haven't been doing too well in the Facebook group of Striving for Eternity. If you've been noticing, we have some homework for you guys, and they are now being posted in the group, the Striving for Eternity group, so that everyone can get in on the questions and answers and see how everyone's responding. Some of you are not doing too well. I think you've been too chatty in the chat room. Just saying. So, but we welcome you. As you know, we're going through the School of Systematic Theology. We are in book number 1. We're calling that the Throne Room of God. We started with a section 1 being the Doctrine of God. And in doing so, we took a look. We started looking at the attributes related to God's deity. Last week, we looked at those attributes related to God's personality. And this week, we will look at those attributes that are related to God's morality. Now, as a reminder, we want to take a look at what attributes are. So what we have here is that attributes are something that cannot grow or change. Attributes are what God has revealed to us, although those attributes are not the sum total of God. So in other words, there's more to God than just what we see there. And then attributes may be ascribed to any person of the Godhead. All right? So any person of the Godhead can have these attributes attributed to him. All right? That becomes important when we look at the lessons on the triunity or Trinity of God. So if you're following along in your syllabus, we are on lesson 3, and we are going to start looking with the first of these attributes that are related to his morality. And when we think of his morality, let's remember that this is one of the things that when we talk to atheists and they say, well, God doesn't exist. I did this quite a bit with many of the people at the Fall for Greenville this weekend. They would say God doesn't exist, and yet they rely on a morality. I mean, they rely on a right and wrong. And so you could just ask them if they think that you're wrong for believing that God exists, and they're usually very quick to say that they think you're wrong. Now, the thing that's interesting with that is you can ask them, as I often do, if there was no God, would we just be chemical reactions? And they're all very quick to say that we are just chemical reactions. There's nothing more to us. And if there's nothing more to us, then how do they explain morality? I mean, if we give it some thought, how do you explain morality as just chemical reactions? Because if I take a can of soda pop. This is an illustration I love to use. It's from Cy, but he uses this, and I like this one. If you take a can of soda pop, or I'm saying soda pop because I just came from the South. You know, y'all talk like that down there. But soda, but you take it, you shake it up, you open the can, what happens? Fuzz comes out, right? That's a chemical reaction. Ask a person, is that morally right or wrong? Did that this weekend, and a guy goes, what? It's not anything. It just is. That's right. Chemical reactions just are. They're not right and they're not wrong. So where in the world do we get right and wrong from? Well, there's only one source where right and wrong can come from. God. So when someone's saying that they know that there's a right and a wrong in the world, then there's got to be more than just chemical reactions. We are not purely chemical reactions. There's more than just the material world. And these attributes of morality are attributes that are passed on to us in some degree. Now, some theologians will talk, and if you study different systematic theology, some different books out there, you'll see that most of the theologians will talk about the attributes of God in two categories. Now, we've defined them in three, but they talk in two categories: incommunicable and communicable. And you say, Andrew, are you just trying to show that you understand these really big words? No, let me explain them. Actually, you use really big words when you want to impress people with yourself, or you really have no idea what you're saying and you want to fool someone. So let's use words we do understand. In other words, the attributes incommunicable, meaning not communicated to us, not given to us, things like when we speak of God, His omniscience, His omnipresence, His omnipotence, those things are just and only to God. We saw most of them in the attributes of deity. The communicable ones are those that are communicated to us, those that we have. Things like we looked at last week, those of personality. Some of these that we're going to look at this week that are communicated from God to us. And so what we have is the fact that the first one here is holiness. Holiness. Now let's take a look at this one. If you have your syllabus there, you're going to see in your syllabus that we have that defined, explained, shall we say, two different ways. And the first way is negatively. So holiness has a negative connotation to it. And if you have if you're taking notes, and you should be, God is separate from all forms of uncleanness and evil. God is separate from all uncleanness and evil. Let's take a look at Leviticus 20, verse 26. Leviticus 20, verse 26 says, "And you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine." So what you have there is that God's holiness means, in definition, that He is separate from evil. He's separate from sin. Therefore, there is no sin within God. That also communicates to us that not only is He separate, and in the passage that we saw there, He commands us to be separate. Now, are we going to be perfectly separate? Are we going to be holy as God is holy? No, we're not. I know there's some that try to teach that. You know what the problem is when they teach that? They teach that they're perfect, they're sinlessly perfect, and they're holy as God is holy, and they're prideful about it, which kind of is a sin. I mean, to think that you're as holy as God is holy is to like totally be blind to your own sin. I mean, how many decisions do we make every day? And we make most of those, if we're going to be honest, not thinking about God at all. And He says that we should put Him first and foremost in every thought, word, and deed. How are we putting Him first? If we're just putting our shoes on, we're just brushing our hair, we're not doing that to the glory of God. So we often don't think about all the things we do. But if we're going to be honest with this, we're going to look at this, we do not act in a way where we are holy like God is holy. But that is what He commands us to be separate from sin. And we need to be totally separate from sin. Now, the issue there is also one where we have to recognize that though we are to be separate, we are also of a nature where we cannot be completely separate, but that is the goal, that is the standard. So that's what we should be striving for. Now let's look at it positively. Negatively is that God is separate from all forms of uncleanness and evil, but positively, God is pure. And that's your blank there. God is pure. Let's take a look at 1 John 1:5. 1 John 1:5. This is the message which we have heard from Him and declare to you, that God is light, and in Him no darkness is at all. And so what you have here is the fact that not only is God separate from evil, but there is no evil inside of him. You see this in James when it says that God cannot tempt anybody with evil because there's no evil in him. This is important. You know, an interesting thing to do, we looked at Leviticus 20, and a really interesting thing to do, a lot of people get confused, what is the purpose of Leviticus? It is a book that many struggle with in understanding its purpose. If you want to see a book, the purpose of it, I did this once. One of the ways, if you remember, in the study of the School of Biblical Hermeneutics, we said that you want to look for repeating themes throughout a book to know its purpose. And when you look through Leviticus, there's a repeating theme, that God is God and not us, and that we should be holy and separate from evil as God is. So to a degree, not a complete degree, but to a degree, we are holy as God is holy, in the sense that when God says that we should be separate from sin. All right? So, let's look at the next one in your syllabus there. It would be letter B, and that is righteousness. Righteousness. Now, this is an expression of His holiness. All right? This would be one of the many, we're going to see several different expressions of God's holiness, and this is the first one. Let me give you the definition here of righteousness for your syllabus. All right, if you're following along in your syllabus, it is this, that God demands all moral beings to conform to His moral perfection. God demands all moral beings to conform to His moral perfection. In other words, what this means is God is the one who defines what is right, not you and I. Many of us would like to be the ones to define right and wrong. This is something when we evangelize very often, we see this with people who want to be the ones to say they get to define right and wrong. And they get to be the ones to say that something is, that God is unjust because, as someone had this weekend, how could God be just if He allowed my little sister to be raped? Well, what are you really doing when you're doing that? Realistically, what you're doing is you're setting up yourself as the standard bearer of what's right and wrong. And God has to obey you and has to submit to you. And that's just not right. That's not the way it works. All right? And so we have to look at this and see that when we look at righteousness, God is the source of righteousness. He defines right and wrong. It is out of His moral character that defines it. Let's take a look at a passage. This one again is in Leviticus. This is in Leviticus 11. Leviticus chapter 11. And as we read along here, it says here that, "For I am the Lord your God." Now notice right there, we see that God is saying that He is the source, okay, of what is righteous. "For I am the Lord your God, you shall therefore consecrate yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy." See the purpose clause. We should be holy because God is holy. "Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So when you look at this passage, you see that God is saying, showing that He is the source of that which is holy, that He is the source of what is righteous. Okay? He is its source. So that is the fact that if we, to the extent that we are righteous, is in the extent that we conform to God's moral perfection. We can do that at different levels here on earth, but a day is coming, oh sweet that day will be, when we conform completely to the moral perfection of God. I cannot wait for that day to be done with this body of sin, to be able to have that complete moral perfection that God has. And so righteousness is to the absolute right that we see in God. When it refers to God, it is talking about his absolute righteousness. He is the source of righteousness. You know, one of the things that I do when we look through these attributes of God, I'm going to plug this a little bit later, and those of you who are students are going to get an email from us this week that's going to contain some of all of these attributes with the verses that you can look them up. I'm going to tell you why we're going to do that. When I think of these expressions of God's holiness and like his righteousness and the ones we're going to look at next, you know, there's times maybe you experience it where you don't know how to pray real well. You know, things are going on in life and it's just hard. And what we see a lot of times is that we struggle. And sometimes it's good to just pray to God about God. And so in my prayer list, which is I keep on my phone, I actually have all of these attributes. These attributes are there, and I pray through them. So in my prayer list, I have things like God's omniscience. And when I pray for God's omniscience, I'm praying things like, Lord, you know the thoughts of my heart, both the good and the bad. Nothing escapes you. You know that, Lord, we're so arrogant that we think we know so much when we don't. And I pray through each of these different attributes. And so what we're going to provide for you who are students, we're going to provide for you a list of all these attributes so that you have them there readily available for you. All right? And that way you can look at them and look back to them, and it'll be something that hopefully you would be able to enjoy when you're doing your prayer time, and maybe develop a prayer list that's fixated and focused on God's attributes. All right? And not having all of our prayers so focused on us, because that's often a problem when so much of our attention, our thoughts are on us. And we need to look to Christ, look to God. And a good way to focus our thoughts on that is to pray through the attributes of God. I pray that way each day. That's one of the ways I pray through that, and I keep adding to that list. Let's look at the next one real quick, and that's his justice. This is another expression of God's holiness, is his justice. And if you look there, justice I have defined in your syllabus is that God judges perfectly, or you can say justly or impartially or correctly, but I choose to say perfectly. God judges perfectly non-conformity to his moral perfections. So he judges in a perfect way. There's nothing inaccurate about the way he judges. And many people think, you know, God will judge my heart and that's a good thing. No, that's a bad thing. God will judge our heart. And because he's just, he's going to judge our heart perfectly. Now this passage that I want to look at is a passage that I memorize for when I witness to people. Because people say, God knows my heart. God will judge me well. Well, let's look at how God will judge. Psalm 7:11. I guess I like it because I can remember, 7-Eleven. If you know that store, maybe you have a 7-Eleven by you. God is a just judge, and God is angry with the wicked every day. This tells us something about God. All right? God is a just judge, but it is because he is a just judge that he is angry with the wicked every day. In other words, God's justice is the very reason why he will judge perfectly, and that we as wicked people are in serious trouble. All right? There's not going to be partiality with God and his justice. All right? And that leads into the next expression of his holiness, which is his goodness. His goodness. Defined here, you see in your syllabus there, God is perfectly moral or perfectly pure, either way, doing what is right and good. So everything that God does is morally right. It's morally pure. He is a good God. Let's take a look at a passage that says that. In Psalm 119, that longest psalm in the scriptures, we see there that it says, "You are good and do good. Teach me your statutes." In other words, we should be learning from God what's good because God is good. He's the definition of good. We know good because we know God. We know what God is, a good is, when we know God. You can't have goodness without God. So when people argue that there can't be God because there's evil in the world, and how could a good God who's all-powerful allow evil? The answer to that is you cannot have goodness without God. You cannot have evil without God. That's not an argument for atheism. It's an argument against atheism. Because once you admit there's evil in the world, evil's the absence of good. And what defines good is God. So you can't have evil without God, and you can't have goodness without God. So when people praise their own goodness, they are relying on God, who is the author of goodness. Let's look at another one. Now this one, how can I put this? Some people refuse to believe that this one even exists. We all know, and we're going to look at this later, so we'll get there. We all know that God is love. And we know that one. And many people will recite that and talk about that, but there's something else. And that is this one right here. Let's look at this. God is wrath. God is a God of wrath. He's a very wrathful God. Let's define this first in your syllabus. God will give retribution or punishment, or retributionary punishment, if you want to get both words, because that's what really you could say. God will give retributionary punishment for any offense or crime. Let's look at a passage here, and it is Ephesians 22. Ephesians 22, verses 22 to 24. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry at all to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. Gee, did I hear those words right? I mean, that almost sounded like God wasn't loving. God is very loving. That's why He's wrathful. What's that? You think that I said that wrong? Let me say it again. Maybe you just need to think through it a little bit more. God is very loving. That is why He is wrathful. He is a wrathful God because He loves. He is a wrathful God because He judges and will give retributionary punishment to crimes. I'm always amazed when people say, God is love. He wouldn't send anybody to hell. If God is love and He won't send anybody to hell, first off, that God doesn't exist. But if that's what you believe, the only question I would ask is, does Hitler deserve to go to hell? I'm amazed how many people think he should. Many people think that Hitler deserves retributionary punishment for the crimes that he committed. The problem we have is we don't see our crimes. We're not better than Hitler. Maybe in a human comparison, but see, human comparisons aren't the comparison. God is the comparison. And we all fall short. All right? So, moving on, We have the fact that we saw that God is holy. God is holy, and we see His holiness. And that is one, we saw that, as you remember, we saw this expressed in 4 different ways. First, His righteousness. Then we saw His justice, His goodness, and lastly, we saw His wrath. And when we saw those things, we saw those were different ways of understanding the attribute or expressions of His holiness. Let's move on to the next attribute, the major attribute. And we're going to see several expressions here, but it is truth. It is truth. And when we look at truth, we see here in your syllabus, letter B, that truth is defined God's knowledge declaring and representing eternally to conform to reality. That's what truth is. Truth is what's real. Truth is not what we want it to be. In other words, we cannot say it's true because we wish it to be. It's true because it is true. In other words, gravity. Let's use that as an example. I just always love to use that as an example. It's a great example. Gravity is something that when we see gravity, it is reality. And if I honestly, I just don't believe in gravity. I can't see it. I can't feel it. I can't taste it. I can't hear it. None of my senses work with it. Gravity must not be real. So I go off the tallest building in the world, or any tall building, and I walk off that building, and immediately I float, don't I? No, I don't. Because my belief doesn't make it real. Reality is that gravity exists. My belief had nothing to do with it. God is reality. And my belief makes no difference to it. So when people say, I struggle with a God that would send people to hell, I cannot believe in a hell. Quite frankly, it doesn't matter what you and I believe. I don't like hell either. But that's reality. And we must deal in reality. We have to stop dealing in fantasy land. All right? And so let's take a look at some of the ways that we can express that different attributes of God that express that truth. All right? Let's look at the first one here. Veracity. Veracity. Okay, and if we look at veracity there, you'll see that defined in your syllabus. And that is defined that God does not waver on truth. That's your blank there. Does not waver on truth. All right, let's look at Numbers 23. Numbers 23, and what you see in Numbers 23 is that it says here, God is not a man that He should lie, nor the Son of Man that He should repent. Has He said He will not do so? Or has He spoken and will not make good? So when you look at this passage, you see here that God does not waver on truth. You can also write in your syllabus there, James 1:17. James 1:17 is another one that God does not, there's no shadow of changing in God. I have in your syllabus that we don't have it on the screen, so sorry about that, but Titus 1:2. God cannot lie. All right? God cannot lie. So we have that God, the veracity of God. All right? That is an element of His truth. Okay? So His veracity is that He does not waver, which is really encouraging if you think about it. If God's not wavering, it means that truth isn't going to change. In other words, truth is universal. It's absolute. Oh, by the way, if this world was created from chaos, from some big explosion, there wouldn't be veracity. Things would be changing like they do in science all the time. You know, these scientists that say this is true, and then later science disproves it. That's not veracity. Reality is veracity. Okay? Truth is veracity. It deals with what's real. And scientists are dealing in a realm where they deal with philosophy and they use it and call it science, and guess what? That's not, I mean, that wavers and changes every time they have a new scientific discovery. And they used to think there was this thing, this ethos that existed, and Einstein proved there was no ethos. And you don't hear talk of it anymore. Science just goes, oh, no, we'll just pretend like that didn't exist. Veracity is very important, okay? Because it means there's no wavering, okay? God does not waver on truth. Next, let's look at his faithfulness. All right? His faithfulness. If you look in your definition, God fulfills his promises. God fulfills his promises. He is steadfast in his affections and his alliances. All right? He's faithful. And it's good that we have a faithful God. Let's look at a passage of scripture for that, and that is Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10, let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering. He who promised is, look at that word, faithful. He is faithful. That's a beautiful thing to see, that God is faithful. He will fulfill those promises he made. Oh, by the way, even those promises he made to Israel. Just saying. For those of you who understand that, if you don't, we're going to look at that when we get to the end times and we study end times. I'm kind of giving away what I believe, huh? Whoops. Some people are going to get online and say I'm a heretic. And those of you are going to go, why is he a heretic? Well, I guess if God is faithful and makes a promise, I believe he's going to carry it through. And that's really the argument that he makes in Romans 9, 10, 11 when he's talking about Israel. If God is faithful to Israel, he's not going to just put them on the shelf and be done with them. God's going to be faithful to Israel. And our salvation is based in that same faithfulness. If God is not faithful to Israel, how could we trust that he'd be faithful to us? All right, let's look at the next category. So the first category we saw was God's holiness. We saw that expressed in his righteousness, his justice, his goodness, and his wrath. Then we saw God's truth as a second main category. So his holiness and then his truth. And in truth we saw God's veracity and his faithfulness. So we saw his holiness, we saw his truth, and now we see the one everyone knows, his love. His love. And we're just trying to see there, if you were getting seasick, hope you didn't get vertigo there, but we wanted to have a little bit of fun. God is love, and everybody knows that verse. So many people quote it. It's one of the most quoted verses by non-believers, right? 1 John 4:8. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Oh, isn't that sweet? God is love. In other words, God is going to give me everything I want. No, that's not the definition of love. I'm sorry. That's the problem. The reason the world uses this verse to try to argue against Christians that are sharing the gospel is because they want to say it's not loving, and God is a God of love, and therefore if we're going to love, we must never say anything that hurts people's feelings. That's not the definition of love. Okay? So let's look at what is. I mean, love, if you look in your syllabus there, this is that which moves God to give of himself. That's what love is giving of yourself to others. Okay? It's not this fluffy love that someone said in the chat room. It's not this fluffy love that people go, well, I just want God I want God to love me the way I am. No, we are to love God the way he is. Not the other way around. We're not God, okay? And so what we have when we see that is, we see that people wrongly define love to be something they want it to be. You need an example? your best life now. I mean, really? This is my best life now? No, not if I'm a Christian. If I'm a Christian, this is not my best life now. This is the worst that life will ever be. The only people that this is your best life now, for unbelievers. This is as good as it gets. After that, yeah. Remember that God is a God of wrath, as well as love. So what we end up seeing is, because we see this love is Him giving of Himself. This is Him giving of Himself. And so it has to properly be defined. Any of you parents out there watching, I know some of you, I see some of you that are watching, that are parents. I know. How do I see you? Because don't you know, I have cameras in your homes too. I watch you all the time when you're falling asleep. You know, I see you with your head back, you know, snoring away because you think I'm not watching. I'm watching you, Joe Conkle. You're sleeping. Wake up, Joe. All right. But what we have is, we have the fact that when we define love as a parent, sometimes it means doing some pretty hard things. My son's not watching, so I'm going to tell a little story. Get myself in trouble if he watches later. My son is writing his essay for college, and he chose to write it on the things he learned that from what he learned from watching me. Not things I've taught him directly, though some were, but things he learned from watching me. Other than being totally humbled and just amazed at what he wrote and just totally like blown away, one of the things that really hit me was he said he learned these things from watching what I do, and he learned that sometimes we have to make hard decisions. He learned from things that I had to correct him on, that he didn't enjoy at the time, but he learned from that. I hated having to correct him at times, and yet it was necessary. God's love requires His justice. So these three interplay. His holiness, His justice, and His love. These three, His holiness, His truth, and His love. These three interplay. You can't take one without the other. His justice, His truth, and His love work together. They're all attributes of God, and you can't separate any one of them. Okay, so let's take a real quick look at the ones that we think of. We think of God's love. The first expression of it we think of is His grace. We think of His grace, which is defined as God's love expressed in giving to man what is not deserved. Giving to man what is not deserved. Titus 2:11-14. For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men. If it appeared to all men, they're without excuse. Teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lusts, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present age, looking for the blessed hope and glorious appearing of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave Himself for us that He might redeem us from every lawless deed and purify for Himself His own special people, zealous for good works. Okay, really, it was only verse 11, but the rest of it was just so great, I couldn't help myself. That's so great, isn't it? That is an expression of God's grace, giving us what we do not deserve. And many of you who know me well, know me personally, you know what I'm going to say here. What happens when you ask me, how are you? You know what most people do? They lie. You know, how are you? And they go, oh, fine. You're not fine, and you know it. What are you doing? You're lying about it. Be honest. So what do I say? Better than I deserve. Because I received God's grace. People all the time say, better than you deserve. You don't deserve the best? No. I violated God's law, and I deserve His wrath and judgment. But He gave me grace. And He gave me one other, and that's the next one. Mercy. He gave me grace and mercy, and it's more than I deserve. Let's look at mercy. If you look at it defined in your syllabus there, mercy is another expression. It's God's love expressed in the withholding of that which is deserved. Now he's withholding. So what you have is grace is giving us what we do not deserve, and mercy is the flip side of the coin, withholding what we do deserve. So God's mercy is that he withholds the punishment owed to us that he gave it to Christ. His grace is that he gives to us the righteousness of Christ that we don't deserve. Okay, and you can see that in 2 Corinthians 5:21. We don't have time to look there, but we'll look at Ephesians 2:4 and 5. But God, who is rich in mercy because of his great love with which he loved us, see how they interplay? The mercy is an expression of his love. Even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace, you have been saved. That's a great passage, isn't it? That's a great verse. And so let's see what we have. The last expression that we have of his love is his long-suffering. His long-suffering. Let's look at the definition there in your syllabus. God's love expressed in the patient bearing of stubborn wills of mankind. Let's look at a passage before we describe that more. 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some count slackness, but long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. This means that God, when we look at this passage, is long-suffering. He is longer suffering than any of us. I mean, some of you may think, you know what, I'm really long-suffering with my children or someone at work or someone you just have to get along with. It's like, oh, I put up with a whole lot. Whew, you don't know how much I put up with. Okay, yeah, my wife can say that. She does put up with a lot. Yeah, right here, look at it. A total amount. Oh, like it's inconceivable how much she has to put up with. But God has to put up with an infinite amount more than anything that we have to put up with anyone else. God's love is expressed in his patient bearing with our stubborn wills. And we can be stubborn, can't we? Very willful sometimes. And God is still patient with us, even when we are acting that way. All right? This is just an encouragement to my heart. And in my prayer time, I thank God so much for his long suffering, because you know what? God could rightly have taken our life the very second that we disobeyed him, which is about the second we came out of the womb and went, wah, 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 I want milk and I want it now. I do a pretty good baby cry. Lots of practice. Right? Isn't that true? If God did not choose to come to earth and die as a man, he would have been absolutely right and absolutely just in sentencing every single one of us to eternity in a lake of fire. He would have been absolutely just, because that's what we deserve. But that's not what he did. That's the beauty of it. God chose to be long-suffering with us as an expression of his love, to patiently bear with us for a very long time. So what we see then is those three things. We saw God's holiness, we saw God's truth, and we saw God's love. And those are the three main categories, and we saw them expressed in different attributes that define God. And if you look in your syllabus, if you have your syllabus there, pull out your syllabus now that the class is over, you're just getting to it. Yeah. And that would actually be a good time for some of you students. I can welcome you. There are some new students to the Academy, some new people that are enrolled. So you can grab a syllabus if you're a student, and you would be able to follow along in your syllabus. But in your syllabus there on the next page is the thought questions for lesson 3. I want to encourage each of you to go onto Facebook, into our Facebook group that we have. In the Facebook group, you're going to see that we're going to post the questions for this week. Well, actually, we'll post the ones from last week because we're a week behind, but we're going to post both last lesson and this lesson this week. Get you guys thinking. We really want to encourage all of you, even if somebody else gave the answer that you wanted to say, put your answer in there. You may get credit for it. What's that? You mean the teacher's going to be grading us? Hey, you never know. I give pop quizzes, get rewards for getting quizzes right, may give a pop test sometime, maybe get extra credit for class participation, which is on Facebook in the group. So let us know your answers, and if you have a question about it, we can be able to communicate with all of us, just not one at a time, but all of us then can interrelate, and it'll be a lot of fun that way. If you have any questions about things that you do want to get answers to, you can contact us whenever you want at academy@strivingforeternity.org. academy@strivingforeternity.org. And we ask you to go on to the page, enroll as a student. You'll see the way that it is. It costs $50 a year. You get 2 syllabuses. The syllabus for this class is 80 pages long of notes. You'll also get about 5-10 minutes after the show, those who are students get to call into a special number, get to do a Q&A if they have any questions from the show, or sometimes it's just a great time of fellowship. That often happens after all the questions are answered. We start talking other topics. We just have a time of fellowship, and so we could do that. You get that as a student. If you really want to save some money with it, get your church involved, because it saves us the shipping cost to ship it to your church. So get a whole bunch of people to join together in your church. There's some churches that watch this in their church building, and then they do the discussion time afterwards. So it's an idea for you. If you have questions on that, you can contact us at academy@strivingforeternity.org. Also want to let you know this week, if you are in New Jersey, specifically Montclair, New Jersey, October 20th, is the Change Collegian Network fundraising dinner. You do have to register for that. There'll be a thing on our Facebook page that for the Striving for Eternity group that'll have the information. If it's not up there now, I'm sure it'll be up there by tonight. That will let you know how you can register for that. They need to get a head count. If you didn't register, go anyway. Get the information, go anyway. I do know we got, as an encouragement, if you don't know him, you definitely want to come out, just to see him. But Brother Robert Gray is going to be coming out just because of the fact that he heard that they would be honoring Striving for Eternity for all the work that we've done with Change Collegian Network. And so I will be receiving that honor, I guess, or whatever they're going to do on behalf of Striving for Eternity. So really want to encourage you to come out and see how they lie about me. Just kidding. I'm sure they will if they say anything nice. But, actually, speaking of encouraging, let's talk about who our brother of encouragement is. Our brother of encouragement this week is someone who I got to know very well this weekend. I knew him before from some outreaches I've done, but this week I really got to know him. And if you're on Facebook, you can go out to our Facebook page, and from the page you can tag him. He's tagged probably by now already, and it is Brother Edlis. He is the one that put together a lot of the work for the Fall for Greenville outreach this weekend, which was a great event. It was a great time, well organized. Just they took it. $20. We had, I think it was 3 meals, a place to stay, teaching, outreach, tracks. Greatest $20 ever spent. It really was good. And Ed is he is a brother who he's a stay-home dad. He is homeschooling his children, which seems kind of weird for many people, but that's where he feels he's called. And he's got several children. He really can use the encouragement, just like stay-home moms need that encouragement. Not too many people think of encouraging a stay-home dad. And some people kind of look at it funny, and that's even more of a reason to encourage him. And yet he has his team, I think they're called the Sidewalk Saints, that go out down there in Greenville each weekend, and they're faithfully proclaiming the gospel, and he's training them. And they just got, he's in a church that's just a wonderful church, just some great people, and a church that's really revitalizing, and they're just doing a great thing. And I want to encourage you to encourage him. You can go out to our Facebook page and do that today to encourage him. And it's encouraging to let him know and to tag him so that others see the things, because there may be some things that you know about him personally that would encourage others to encourage him. And so we thank you for coming out this week. We can't wait to see you next week. Next week we will be discussing a great topic. Some people have already been hinting to it. If you've been seeing on Facebook, did a great photo of it. But we're going to be talking about the names of God in Lesson 4. The names of God. What is God's name? Tune in next week and you're going to know. And we look forward to seeing you next week. And remember to strive to make today an eternal day for the glory of God.